Hello everyone, welcome back and welcome to the new semester. So in this semester you will have a few different papers. So one of these papers is DSE A2. DSE A2. So in this paper you will have literary theory and literary criticism. And this paper is going to be quite different from the papers that you have been reading so far. Like so far you have had the CC papers, which mostly consist of texts in the form of poems or essays and even short stories and novels. But this paper, DSE A2, is going to be a bit different, quite a bit different, because here you are going to read essays, but these are not essays in the sense of literature as you have known so far, right? And so, how are they different? And what are these texts we are going to read? So, those are some of the things I'll be talking about today. So since this is the first lecture, I directly don't want to dive into the texts because this is a completely new genre that you are going to learn about. And when you first think of it, the term literary theory does not seem to make much sense. So that is why I won't dive into the texts today, but I'll give you an overview of the texts that we have. Right. So about this paper, DSC A2 is divided into two sections. So the first is literary theory, and the second is literary criticism. Now, you probably know who is going to teach you what. So I'm going to teach you literary theory. To be specific, I'm going to teach you Antonio Gramsci's Prison Notebooks, selections from Prison Notebooks. Prison Notebooks is the name of a book that he wrote in prison, and you have some portions of that book, right? You probably have a specific chapter in there, formation of intellectuals. So apart from Gramsci, I will teach you Rabindranath Tagore and his essay Nationalism in India. Now there's a third text, but this third text is actually in relation to Rabindranath Tagore's essay. So this text is Ramchandra Guha's essay, rather Ramchandra Guha's introduction to Rabindranath Tagore's Nationalism in India. So one, Antonio Gramsci; two, Rabindranath Tagore's Nationalism in India; and three, or I should have put this in the second place, Ramchandra Guha's essay introducing Rabindranath Tagore's Nationalism in India. So these are the three texts I will be teaching you from this paper. So, well, what is literary theory? Because when you think of these things, nationalism in India and maybe even formation of intellectuals, those surely don't sound like traditional literature, right? I'm quite sure most of you would agree that they don't seem to be literature as we know it. So this particular lecture, the first one, is dedicated to understanding or getting an overview of what literary theory means and what it does and why we have to study it, right? So yeah, let's begin with the introduction, right? So if we begin with the question, what does the term literary theory bring to your mind, right? So if you ask this question, you probably will get a lot of answers, and none of those answers are going to be along the lines of traditional literature, right? You probably are not thinking of a poem or a short story or novel, right? So what is this? And well, I would like to answer this question by way of telling you about an anecdote. Um, this anecdote is when I first heard of the term literary theory. So I also heard it when I was in the third year, and at that time literary theory was not taught in the syllabus, right? It's only with the CBCS system that you now have it in the graduation syllabus. So you will eventually face it in the master's level wherever you go, but it's thanks to the CBCS system that you are being introduced to something quite advanced at an earlier stage. So well, back to the anecdote. When I first heard the term literary theory, it naturally didn't make much sense to me because theory is something we usually associate with the sciences, right? Theories in physics, theories in biology or chemistry or whatever, even theories in economics, right? But theory, the term, does not make much sense when you put literature or literary in front of it. And that was also my first impression. And I also had this idea, or I thought that literary theory was probably about having to probably had to do with writing literature or to create literature. So my first impression was these are probably theories which are going to teach me or teach whoever is reading those theories how to write a certain kind of literature, right? So the question here then is, are literary theories kind of things that teach you how to write a poem, or are these theories going to guide you if you write a play? Well, short answer is no. The long answer we'll find out during this course, right? So yeah, um, like I said, if you ask if literary theories were similar to theories in physics or chemistry or biology or the sciences, or for that matter any other stream, they're definitely not similar. But they also have certain similarities, and we are going to see them next, right? And I also want you to understand why we should study literary theory, because it really doesn't make sense to study something just for the sake of the syllabus. Because if you don't understand why we are to study literary theory, you probably won't be interested in literary theory at all, other than the purposes of your syllabus. And that definitely isn't a very noble intention to begin with. So now, before getting into further detail, just to make you aware of one common misconception, again, this goes back to the anecdote I just referred to. The common misconception that literary theories are about writing or creating literature. Keep in mind, absolute no. Literary theories are not going to tell you or teach you how to write a poem, how to write a short story, or anything like that. Right? These are more about theories of reading and interpreting. Okay, so first clue, literary theories are not about creating or writing literature, though they may be applied in that sense. But strictly speaking, literary theories have to do with how you read a work of literature or how you interpret culture, right? And once again, I keep saying, I've said this before, that when I use the word literature, I do not just mean poems and short stories. I mean culture at large, art at large. Okay, I'm including paintings. I also mean films when I say literature. So I'm using it in a very broad manner. All right. So let's move on. So let's now try to define literary theory. We already have, I have already mentioned that literary theory is different from other kind of theories, but it is also a bit similar. This is where we will find out what those dissimilarities and similarities are. And we will also look at some applications of literary theory. So yeah, taking the dictionary example, or sorry, the dictionary definition rather. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines the term literary theory as the conceptual basis of a study or area of study, of a subject or an area of study, right? So if you take that definition in mind, um, it does look, literary theories do appear to be similar to theories in physics and chemistry, right? But let's move on. So one easy way to understand literary theory is to read it as the conceptual basis of the study of literature, right? So study of any literature or any culture. Okay. So and always keep in mind that reading is different from studying. You read a work of literature, you can do it for pleasure, you can do it for the purposes of a syllabus. But when you study, there is also a critical element to study, right? When you study something, you're doing more than reading. You are engaging with it, you're participating in it, right? So theories come in when you study literature. They tell you, they give you, they provide you a mechanism or methodology or technique of studying, right? So basically, literary theory consists of tools. We'll see what those tools are later, right? So literary theory consists of tools that helps you read better, understand better, and criticize better. There are definitely other applications. Basically, literary theory, you can think of literary theory as an attempt to define the nature, status, and function of all kinds of arts. So let's now look at a few synonyms, terms that are often interchangeably used with literary theory. So you'll find people referring to critical theory, right? It basically means literary theory, or cultural theory, which also means the same thing. And then again, there's the term literary criticism. So while these terms are not exact synonyms of each other, but they may be used interchangeably. In fact, they often are used interchangeably. So keep that in mind. So once again, what are we looking at? We are looking at theories which help us read better, understand better, and criticize literature better, right? Basically, we are engaging with texts, all sort of texts, whether it's books, whether it's poems, whether it's an advertisement that you see, right? And even films and TV series, the series that you watch. So let's now have a look at what the necessity of such a thing is. All right. So, let me provide you with a metaphor, and I'm hoping this metaphor will help you understand theory better, or understand why theory is necessary better, right? So, theory gives you different lenses or spectacles to see the world. Theory does to culture what microscopes, telescopes, and periscopes do to the external world, right? Now, that's a metaphor. Let me explain it, and I'm hoping that will make sense to you, right? Because if it does not, please let me know, and I'll try to explain it better, right? So, what do telescopes, microscopes, and periscopes do to the external world? A microscope allows you to see things that may be close to you, but are so tiny that are not visible to the naked eye, right? And a microscope allows you to see. Microscope enlarges that thing for you. It could be a germ, it could be a virus, whatever, but it enlarges it in front of you so that you can see it. So whatever was not visible to the naked eye is now visible when you use a microscope. Now the telescope again is an instrument which allows you to see things that are not visible to the naked eye because of the distance, right? Periscope is another such instrument which allows you to see things which are directly not visible, probably at a certain angle, right? Now, where does literary theory come in? So when you read a work of literature, or you look at an ad, or when you watch a film, or maybe you just look at a graffiti drawn somewhere in the city, right? So when you look at these things, you may be missing out on certain things, right? Think of this: when you look at your floor, when you happen to gaze at your floor, do you see germs roaming around? You don't. You need a microscope for that, right? Similarly, literary theories are tools, right? I have used the word lenses here, which allow you to see things that are not visible directly. That doesn't mean there's a germ hiding in your book and you know a theory and suddenly that germ becomes visible inside, right? It's not like that. But I hope you're smart enough to understand what I'm referring to. So yeah, literary theory provides you several lenses, right? And with those lenses, you can see, read, and understand things which a plain reading, okay, which an uncritical reading wouldn't have shown you, wouldn't have exposed in front of you. All right. So theory allows you to understand texts better, and they enable readers to contextualize any cultural product. Cultural product meaning everything that is produced other than the things that you eat are cultural products. Like even one may argue that things that we eat are also cultural products, but that's a separate debate for a separate class maybe. But let's focus on other cultural products like books, uh, advertisements, films, all of those things, right? Basically, apart from showing you what is not visible, literary theory also allows you to read in between the lines, right? Now let us look at some applications of literary theory. All right. Now, as I have mentioned several times, literary theories apply to all cultural products. Again, in the broadest use of the term literature, they give you different lenses to read culture better, right? They unravel power relations between characters, power relations that were otherwise not visible. Right? When you suddenly read a text through the lens of, say, feminism, you find how the gender relations in that text are are out there, and you may have missed them if you weren't aware of literary theory. If you weren't aware of feminist literary theory. Similarly, if you are aware of a Marxist theory and then you read a certain text, or say if you read Charles Dickens, you'll suddenly realize that there are labor relationships, master labor relationships in the novels that you probably didn't realize when you read it the first time. Understood? So these provide you lenses. So literary theories are also useful to find whether a cultural product is historically accurate, right? Like you just can't go on saying that a certain TV series is an accurate depiction of the medieval period, right? What literary theory allows you to do is it gives you tools to actually find out whether what a show is claiming is historically accurate. So, and yeah, one more thing is that literary theories also reveal the political and social character of any literature that you may be reading or any cultural product that may be in front of you. Because remember, at this stage, since you're third year students now, you have to keep in mind that all literature is political, and what literary theory allows you to do is to see through those political messages. They make those political and social characters of texts bare in front of you. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is the nature of literary theory. So, so when you think about literary theory, um, several questions are addressed by the theories that we will later speak about. Now, I have listed some of these questions. Let me read them for you, and I'll explain as I read them. So the first question that a lot of literary theories tend to ask is, what is the source of literature? Is it internal to the author or artists, or is it external to them? Right. So let's take a simple example and let's talk about this question. So if you pick up a romantic poet, say take up Keats, and you pick up one of his poems, say Ode to the Nightingale, or you can choose any other poet or author for that matter. But let's take the example of Keats and his Ode to the Nightingale. Right. Now, there are theories which are going to ask what is the source of literature. Now, the straightforward answer is the source is John Keats, right? But that's not what literary theory is about, obviously, right? That is what class 5 is all about. So, what does literary theory ask? It asks that when Keats writes this poem, is it a reflection of his inner self, or is he induced or triggered to write that poem by external events? Able to follow now? Right? Keep that in mind. Any work of literature may be written internal uh, due to maybe induced internally, or maybe triggered due to external events, right? There may be a catastrophe. For example, we are living through a catastrophe right now. Maybe someone writes a poem that is directly influenced or written due to the pandemic, right? And then some theorists come and ask whether um, the content of that poem is internal or external, or it may be both, right? There may be works of literature which are a reflection of both internal conflicts and the external world, right? So there are poems being written right now, where people are writing about their own experiences during the lockdown, and they're also writing about how the external world has affected their experience of the lockdown, right? So let's move to the second question. Does literature draw us close or take us away from truth or reality? Now, these terms are very philosophical: truth, reality. And at this stage, once again, um, one more thing that you must keep in mind, and is that in third year, you cannot stay away from philosophy, right? It's somehow going to enter into your literature, right? So, does literature draw us close or take us away from truth or reality? So, when it comes to truth and reality, these are all ongoing debates. These are debates. These are terms that are being debated about for centuries, for millennia. As far as I can tell, people have spoken and debated these things since human beings have spoken the first word. Nevertheless, there are theories, literary theories. which try to understand whether a particular work of literature diffuses reality, takes us away from reality, or brings us closer to it. Now, whether what is reality is another question altogether, and that is something we may take up in the later classes, or while we when we actually talk about the text, because this is one issue which Gramsci will talk about: reality and how it affects our social world, and how that social world is then reflected in literature, and what can be done about it. Right. The third question is: is an artist, a poet, or a writer just a craftsman? Is he a craftsman, or is he or she a genius who has been divinely inspired? Now, once again, these are debatable terms, but let's talk about them for a moment. On the one hand, you have the term artist, which is a general term and can be applied to people from several areas. Like you can call a poet an artist, a writer is also an artist in a sense, a painter is also an artist, and so is a musician or a dancer. But art and craft are two different things, right? Now, now there is one basic difference that you need to be aware of. That is craft. When it comes to craft, craft is often very well defined to the point that if you replicate someone else's work, you should be able to reproduce it, right? So there are people who argue that cooking is not an art, it's a craft, right? Now, why do they say that? What is their rationale behind saying it? These people say that cooking is not an art but a craft, because if I follow the same instructions or the same procedure that my mother does while preparing a certain dish, the result of my cooking will be the same, right? This is the argument used to justify that cooking is a craft. Now, I'm not saying this is my view. This is I don't entirely subscribe to that, FYI. But the point is, there is an argument where artists and craftsmen are different, right? So an artist is often said to be someone who is divinely inspired, someone who is inspired by, you know, maybe a goddess, a god, a muse, for that matter, right? So once you have noted this basic difference between an art and a craft, you can probably observe that a craftsman is creating something by replicating something, or by inspiring from something that has previously been done. That is not necessarily true for art. All right. So there are literary theories which are going to ask, or which are going to explore, whether artists and poets are just craftsmen, or are they divinely inspired geniuses who suddenly had like it's like enlightenment, they suddenly had an idea and they wrote something, right? Is it like that, or are they following someone? So fourth question: does literature serve an useful purpose in society? Short answer is no, but long answer is quite complicated, and let's hope literary theory will help us find out what those purposes are, if there are any, that is. Finally, is a work of art a self-enclosed artifact whose meaning is external or transcendent, or a product of various social forces? Now, you probably have noticed that the questions the questions are getting more and more complicated, right? The first question was pretty simple: what is the source of literature, right? And now we are asking about whether literature is transcendent, whether it is self-enclosed, right? All of those stuff. But that's what theory is all about. They'll ask very simple questions, but they will also explore extremely difficult and complex ideas. Now, let's talk about the last questions for a moment before we move on. So, is a work of art a self-enclosed artifact whose meaning is external or transcendent, or a product of various social forces? Now, uh, going back to the first example I gave you, the example of John Keats and Ode to a Nightingale, remember there are theories which are going to ask you whether literature is internal or external, whether Keats wrote that poem because he felt something within, or two, whether his the external world around him uh, moved him in such a way, triggered him to write that poem, right? So whether is literature external? That is a question that is repeated here. But what does it mean when we say, or when we ask, whether literature is transcendent? Now, transcendent is a term which refers to things that are beyond the physical world, right? So in other words, the question whether literature is transcendent asks whether literature has any value outside our immediate physical reality, right? Now, this is where religious literature also comes in. That is not something we are going to discuss at length, but remember, there are literatures across cultures throughout the world, right, where a work of literature is considered to be transcendent. It's considered to be more valuable outside of what immediate reality is about, right? And finally, are works of literature a product of social forces, right? Again, take the example of Charles Dickens. Obviously, you can apply it to all texts, but Charles Dickens is an easy example to follow. If you have read any of his novels, then you probably know that he is writing about social realities, right? There are literary theories which ask whether any work of literature, any, mind you, it can also apply to a romantic poem, whether that poem is a product of social forces, right? Now, how that study is done, now these are just general questions. As you read the literary theory, you will find out that there are much more detailed and particular questions which are also tailored to be asked to specific texts and specific authors. For now, let's focus on these general questions and let's move on to what the bearings of having literary theory are. So, bearings meaning how literary theory affect the way we read literature or our world in general. So, one way literary theory affects us is that it helps us to see how we and our culture are stored in art, right? Remember, art is culture is all around us. Culture is what we do, but art is where we stored our culture, right? Art is the compressed form of our culture, which is why when you read Homer, you refer to a time, say 3000 years ago, right? It is believed that there are um, that Homer, while writing the Iliad and the Odyssey, preserved Greek culture from that era in writing those works, those epics, right? The same can be said of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, or any other epic for that matter from anywhere in the world. The next bearing that I would like to talk about is that literary theories, they affect or they change the way you think of beauty, truth, and life. Once again, these are philosophical terms. Beauty, truth, life, all these are um, being debated in philosophy for as long as human beings have lived. And but then again, that only strengthens the point that at this point in your study of literature, you cannot avoid philosophy at all. Finally, the third bearing is that it affects literary theory affects our notions of politics, economics, and society. Right. So one, it affects our culture and us as individuals and as families or groups of people. Two, it messes up with our ideas of beauty, truth, and life. Like literally messes up because once you read literary theory, um, your ideas of notions of beauty and truth will change for sure. And the other thing it does is that it affects your ideas of politics, economics, and society. Right. Now that said, let's now look at some categories of literary theories or orientations. So literary theories, explore the relation between texts and their authors, their audience, the world around the text, and sometimes with the texts themselves. Right. Now, I want you to have a look at this diagram which is on display. This is a diagram based on ideas of a scholar called M.H. Abrams. Now, M.H. Abrams is a thinker who wrote a book called The Mirror and the Lamp, and in that book, he proposed that there are say tons of theories, right? There may be 50 theories, maybe more. But the idea is all these theories can be categorized um, as follows, right? And those categories are drawn in this image. So at the center of this diagram, you have the text. Again, this text is a word which you should take very broadly, right? Don't think of it as the book in front of you. It may also be the screen in front of you. right? It may also be a cinema screen. It may also be a graffiti. And I'm just repeating what I said before, but remember that at this stage, text refers to not just a poem or a short story. It refers to all elements, all products of culture, starting from advertisements and posters and placards, everything, right? Even a slogan, right? Even a political slogan is is a text, right? Now, according to M.H. Abrams, there are basically four orientations around which all theories are built, right? So hundreds of theories, but these theories fit into some category or the other. What are these categories? The first category explores the relationship between a text and its author. That's number one. Second category explores the relationship between a text and the world. The third category explores the relationship between a text and the audience, the people who are reading it, viewing it, listening to it, everything. And finally, um, the final relationship is the text, is that of a text with itself, right? So these are relationships that literary theories, different literary theories explore, right? And all these orientations have names. So one is mimetic, the next is pragmatic, the third is expressive, and the fourth is objective, right? So what are mimetic theories? Now, mimesis is a word in Greek which means imitation. Mimetic theories are theories which ask whether a text imitates reality or not. They are going to study whether a particular text brings us closer to reality or takes us away from reality. So, in other words, mimetic theories are those which explore the relationship of a text and the world around it. All right. The next kind of theory is pragmatic theory. Pragmatic theories are those which deal with social and didactic functions of art, right? The word pragmatic means real or practical, right? And as such, pragmatic theories are those that study the impact of art on the audience. So in other words, pragmatic theories explore the relationship between a text with its audience, a song with its listeners, a film with its viewers, and so on and so forth. All right. Finally, pragmatic theories also consider the aesthetic quality of a work of literature. All right. The third kind is expressive. Now, expressive theories are those that explore relationships of texts with their authors. All right. How did an author come to create it, basically, right? So, expressive theories focus on the artists or the poets. They see art as a reflection of internal realities, or rather than external realities, right? So internal and external realities are two things that you need to separate at this moment to understand this idea. So internal realities are those are the perceptions, thoughts and feelings and emotions of the person creating the work, right? And external realities are everything else, right? So in expressive theories, you study to what extent a work of literature is an expression of the internal realities of a person. So if you take again, if you go back to that example of John Keats and Ode to a Nightingale, in terms of an expressive theory, you'd probably try to study to what extent was Keats able to express himself, what was Keats feeling when he wrote it, right? You would probably look into the author's biography and so on, right? So basically, you look at the poet or the artist in expressive theories. So the core question, the fundamental idea of having expressive theories is to ask what is a poet, not who is a poet. Remember? So this important distinction: what is a poet and who is a poet. Who is a poet is very easy. Poet is a person who writes poems. But what is a poet is a very complicated question, right? Now, one might say you're objectifying poets, but that's not it at all. What is a poet is a very serious question, by asking which we try to understand what are the circumstances under which a poem was written, uh, what are the circumstances under which a poet created, how those circumstances triggered him to write, right? So we are getting into the biographical aspects of any artwork or any artist, to be more specific. And the last question, what does it mean to be an artist, right? What does it mean to be a poet or a short story writer? So again, short answer is to be a poet means to waste your time by writing poems. But long answer, we're going to find out in this course, right? So there's one more type of theory. These are objective theories, and these deal with the relationship of texts with themselves, right? Weird, right? Texts in relationships with themselves. What do texts do? They read themselves? No, they don't. What do they do then? So objective theories are kinds of theories where an artwork is seen as self-contained, right? Now, where else would a how else would a artwork be contained, right? If they are not self-contained. So sees artworks as self-contained, self-referential entities that should be studied apart from the other three theories. What are the other three categories? Mimetic, expressive, and pragmatic theories. In objective theories, you see a text as self-contained. Let me explain that for a moment. What do I mean when I say self-contained? Now, if I go on and randomly tell you that a text is self-contained, you will probably say, no, sir, the text is contained in a library or a bookshop. But when I say self-contained, or when I say that a work of literature or a work of art is self-contained, I'm saying that when you judge that work, when you study or criticize that work, you should look only at the work, only at that work, and not how it interacts with the external world or with the creator or with reality in general. Understood? So objective theories are those that do not want to ask, that are not interested in the relationship between a work of literature and the world outside it. They're not interested in how the author was feeling when the work was created. Okay, they're not interested whether the author wrote the poem because someone in his family died. They're just interested in the work. Are you able to follow? So in objective theories are those which try to fundamentally study a work of literature or any work of culture as things which are not related to anything else but themselves. All right. So in this kind of theory, an artwork is seen as a microcosm. Right. So what is a microcosm? Microcosm is a word that comes from the word cosmos. Cosmos meaning universe, micro meaning small, right? Tiny, right? So there is macro and micro. Macro meaning large, micro means small. So when you say microcosm, you when you call a text a microcosm, you call it a universe in its own, right? So if you read a text of if you read a literary text, and if you are an objective theorist, you are interested in that text alone. That doesn't mean you don't eat. You obviously you do, but it means that when you read that text and when you judge that text or criticize it, you are interested in only those things that are written in in that text. You are not interested in what the author felt. You are not interested in what may have happened in his country at that time. You are not even interested in the socio-political circumstances that may have led to the creation of that work. You are only interested in the text itself. All right. So these are the four orientations of theory. Now, in the next lesson, the next lecture, we are going to look deeper into literary theories, and I'll try to build a foundation so that we are led organically into the texts that we are going to study for this semester. Right? It doesn't suddenly make sense to study Rabindranath Tagore's nationalism in India without properly understanding what theory is and what it may do to your reading of literature and your understanding of the world. So I'll stop here, and in the next lecture, we'll discuss this in greater detail before we then move to the text. All right, then, bye.